Welcome to the podcast. So, this is the second time I've recorded this video. I guess, I don't know, but look at the lighting now. This is amazing, isn't it? So, okay. Welcome to Godward, the podcast. I'm your host, Casey. This is going to be the episode on Emil Cioran's writing and thinking. But as a prelude to that, I want you to first consider this clip from Michael Millerman, whom I like, by the way. He does good work, and what I say after this is not at all intended to take anything away from what he's doing. Ready? Watch.
When it comes to being with, one of the things he says characterizes Dasein is our discourse. In our discourse, which is speaking, listening, and even being silent, we learn something about beings. So in speaking about things, our speech has the function of disclosing beings or disclosing being. However, it can also cover up, conceal, distort, confuse, muddy the waters, and do all of those things. And Heidegger says that because always and for the most part we don't see ourselves as being in a world, but rather we're collapsed into world and interpreting ourselves in terms of world, something happens to our speech, which is quite interesting. He says that we are always speaking about things without understanding them in their deeper dimension. And their deeper dimension means here specifically their relationship to Dasein as itself exposed to the ground of being, so to speak. So we are this constitution being in the world, and at our basis, as it were, using this sort of spatial thinking, if we're being in the world, at our basis, there's this fundamental ontological dimension. And genuine understanding is when we are disclosing beings, that means events, occurrences, people, things, ourselves, modes and ways of being, history, time, tradition, philosophy, thoughts, art, music, all of that, when we're understanding it, that is disclosing it and relating it to the fundamental ontological ground, which is its genuine, resting place, so to speak, or its genuine source and origin where it derives its meaning from. We don't do that for the most part, according to Heidegger. Instead, we treat things in an uprooted fashion. We treat things like just beings without seeing their deep relationship to Dasein and to being as such.
And in doing so, we speak about things without genuinely understanding them. He calls that idle talk.
Idle talk means you talk about something without genuinely understanding it. And he thinks that characterizes Dasein, always and for the most part, as a necessary mode of our existence.
Now, the question I want us to consider here, again, in relation to Cioran's writing, which is very different, at least superficially, from Heidegger's, is this question. Is it true that Heidegger's writing is so abstract and so fundamentally verbal that we must see it as essentially different from the speech of someone like Jesus, who preferred to speak in images and parables, and who declined to give prosaic explanations? And if that is true, then we must conclude, I think, that Heidegger and Jesus were in disagreement about what matters most, about their chief concerns, so to speak. And let me hint here at the start that what I think is that there may have been quite a lot of agreement, actually, at what Captain Ahab called a little lower layer between the likes of Heidegger and Jesus, in spite of apparent dissimilarity. My hypothesis, or hypothesis, in the sense that it's not fully developed, is that Jesus and Heidegger, along with, on the one hand, Buddha and Parmenides and Cioran, and people like, on the other hand, Schopenhauer and William James, is that fundamentally in that place toward which all their language directs our attention, they ultimately agree. And then, where they appear to disagree, in their differences in expression, we can understand those as different modalities, or different valences, or different registers, different tones, different vibrational frequencies, different styles, different pedagogical priorities, or something like that. Okay, so that's kind of the frame for this episode. Now, Emil Cioran was born in Romania in 1911, in what is now Hungary, and his father was actually an Orthodox Christian priest, his mother the local head of the Christian Women's League. At the University of Bucharest, he met Eugene Ionesco and Mircea Eliade. He was fluent in German. He read widely, including modern writers like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Dostoevsky, who all influenced him significantly. He moved to Paris when he was 26 and lived there for the rest of his life. His first few books were published in Romanian, and after that he switched to writing in French. That's all I'll say about his biography. But it is remarkable how well hidden he has been, or at least how well hidden he used to be. When I was in my 20s, for example, no one talked about Emil Cioran. I discovered him by luck, basically because I liked the look of the book covers in, one of these Research One University bookstores that you find kind of rarely in America on Purdue's campus. And none of the other graduate students would read Cioran with me at the time. Cioran was aware of Heidegger's takes on language and being. He cites Heidegger from time to time, but it seems to me like he discovered the same notions himself. And I think he expressed them comparably well, or I might even say better, at least to my taste. Cioran says at one point, quote, "When modes of expression are worn out, art tends toward nonsense, toward a private and incommunicable universe. An intelligible shudder, whether in painting, in music, or in poetry, strikes us, and rightly, as vulgar or out of date. The public will soon disappear." The public. Art will follow shortly. A civilization which began with the cathedrals has to end with the hermeticism of schizophrenia. And look, he's not even going to explain it to you, and neither am I. These are aphorisms, folks. In my opinion, even Pascal and Nietzsche would have to tip their cap to Cioran. French was a second language for him, and you can feel him work at it. But the product is better for it. He has stripped out almost everything unnecessary and even some of what is necessary. The aphorism is, I think, almost reasonably thought to be like a native French invention, so to speak. And here, in Cioran, it seems to be perfected in French by a foreigner, maybe to the trouble of French people. Now, I guess I should say, of course, I'm reading it translated into English by Richard Howard, a poet in his own right, and one with a reputation as being an excellent translator. And this is obviously a good translation. He translated all of Cioran's books, and if any translation ever works, especially works in the sense of translating the lyricism itself, I think that Howard's translations of Cioran really seem to do the trick. There isn't exactly an argument or much of a narrative in most of Cioran's books. I've read about 5 or 6 of them. And yet, they are an intellectual autobiography. And that's the thing that keeps me coming back to reading Cioran. I read him, and I begin to know this man, this human, this mind, his interiority. And I think maybe you have to read Cioran like this, to read more than one of his books, or at least to read an entire book in a day, so that when he drops his one-liners, you're able to understand them in the context of the rest of the stuff in the book, or in his oeuvre, in his corpus. For example, sometimes, quote, here's going to be 9 words, and this is the whole aphorism, quote, "To be a Raskolnikov without the excuse of murder." Now, I can imagine that for some of you, this is just 9 words that barely mean anything, but for me, I absolutely get what he's on about here. Raskolnikov is, of course, Dostoevsky's 19-year-old anti-hero in Crime and Punishment, remembered usually for murdering the old pawnbroker and her sister. But Cioran remembers Raskolnikov, as he hints here, instead for the anxiety and obsession and paranoia that follows him around after the murder. And as usual, in this aphorism, Cioran gives what would be a solid observation an extra half-turn, and we realize that he is considering what it would be like to be a person who is anxious and obsessed and paranoid for no reason. Not because you did anything awful like Raskolnikov, merely as a default way of being. Of everyone I've ever read, only Emily Dickinson can hold a candle to Cioran for economy of language. He says so much in each aphorism, and he knows it. He even gives himself a sort of credit. He says, quote, "Every word affords me pain, yet how sweet it would be if I could hear what the flowers have to say about death." I mean, this is caviar for connoisseurs of literature, I think. But it's also a kind of trap, because the language, the lyricism, is simultaneously so aesthetic and so confessional, you can't put it down. And you kind of can't fail to understand it. I mean, listen to this and just be the sponge for a minute. Just absorb this. He says, quote, "Dislocated monads. Here we are at the end of our prudent hopes, our well-planned anomalies. More than one sign heralds the hegemony of delirium." Like, wow, right? It's so good. It borders on enigmatic. I mean, it's mystery enlanguaged. You know what I mean? It's so fun to read because he's not condescending. It's the opposite of that, right? I don't know what the opposite of condescending is. Condescending, right? He's requiring you to elevate in order to meet him where he is. But then every once in a while, every couple pages, Cioran will sort of drop you right down to the bottom of the imagination in this like unmistakable way. In one case, for example, he says, quote, "In this great dormitory, as one Taoist text calls the universe, nightmare is the sole mode of lucidity." I mean, And I'll tell you the effect this has on me, at least. The worst thing about it. It's like remembering something that I wanted to forget. You know, a bite of rotten food. Or like the feel of something slithering under my foot in shallow, murky water. Like, I don't want it to be there. I don't want to remember it. But it is there. I've thought these things myself. And here, in beautiful words, I am shown those thoughts again. The French title of the book, I can't even pronounce. Syllogismes de l'amateur, something like that. Again, Zed Des can correct, or Paul Talk can correct my pronunciation. But apparently it might be rendered literally as bitter syllogisms, or bitter sayings. But the full title used for this translation that I'm using is All Gall is Divided, Gnomes and Apothegms. Now, an apothegm is a short, witty, instructive saying, basically an aphorism. A gnome is a word I had to look up, G-N-O-M-E, and it is said, the definition said, a brief reflection or maxim, a pithy saying. So again, basically an aphorism. At times, Cioran will extend these short sayings to almost fully constituted paragraphs, even short essays, and all these sayings are very loosely organized into thematic chapters in the book. But even then, it's very loose. I think you could open to any page at random and read it backwards and not lose terribly much. To my mind, this is sort of a huge artistic credit to Cioran because each individual aphorism has to be an entire thought. And there are so many of them here. They may not be fully fleshed out, but there are 1,000 starts here. And almost every one of them contains a significant degree of a certain kind of poetry. The modern, with a capital M, or like modernists, seem to welcome the reign of the fragment. And I think Cioran was one of its highest practitioners, one of the high points of modernism. Okay, poetry, Casey, what do you mean by that? Are these sayings rhymed? Do they have rhythm? No. But rhyme and rhythm are not the only essential elements of good poetry. Remember my episode on the Iliad, where I tried to share with you as many of Homer's similes as I could. And what's remarkable about those similes is how anchored they are in physical reality, in what poets will tend to call image. No ideas but in things, William Carlos Williams said in the 20th century. And that part of poetry is all over the place in Cioran, to the point where it's clear that this is entirely how he thinks. He will say, for instance, quote, "Every thought should recall the ruin of a smile." And he expects you to picture that in your head, play it out like a little GIF or GIF. And then you will realize this thought really can't be expressed another way. Or it certainly can't be expressed better in abstract, non-imagistic, non-metaphorical language. And yet, I feel that I am making a certain kind of progress in what might be called philosophical thought, even as it's all smooth sailing, akin to poetry as I read it. Somehow, Cioran is one part philosopher and one part poet. Maybe you could say Parmenides and Heraclitus are his true antecedents. Listen again to exactly the point I'm trying to describe here in this next little aphorism. He says, listen carefully, you're going to miss this one the first time you listen to it, but try. He says, quote, "Every thinker at the start of his career opts, in spite of himself, for dialectic or for weeping willows." I mean, did you hear that? Did you catch that? Do you understand him? I mean, I could sit here all day and try to explain that to you, but you either get it already or you probably never will, you know? I mean, I have weeping willows in my backyard, by the way, and I planted one of them when my son was born. So I kind of think I get it. If you don't get it, if you understand nothing else and you need me to try to explain it to you, you're not really getting it, but I'll say this, like, in the tug of war, if you have to choose in life between the dialectic and weeping willows, I think you should understand that Cioran he seems to value things as much as ideas. And sometimes, and this is where it's most interesting, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, in things themselves, like in a weeping willow tree, he sees an idea. And you kind of have to be able to do that with him in order to, I think, in order to get the full effect of what he's doing. In this next apothegm, he starts with a quote and then offers one sentence of commentary. Okay? So listen, ready? So the first sentence is him quoting someone. Second sentence is his commentary on what they said. He doesn't identify the speaker, but you'll get it. Ready? Quote, "I am like a broken puppet whose eyes have fallen inside. This remark of a mental patient weighs more heavily than a whole stack of works of introspection." Works of introspection. I mean, so take something like, Augustine's Confessions or Rousseau's Confessions, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, whatever. Make a whole stack of these. And they are so much fluff compared to the single image given by a mental patient here. I mean, that's beautiful. In this one-liner of a comment, Cioran shows himself to be an incredibly sensitive listener, observer, perceiver. And of course, the corollary to that is he expects readers to equal his sensitivity, to read as slowly as is necessary. These aphorisms are starts, they are leads, they are provocations. But the reader has to consummate the thing, You got to meet him halfway, as I said. Same sort of thing when he says later in the book, quote, "What is the use of frequenting Plato when a saxophone can just as well offer a glimpse of another world?" I love that, right? I think in the end, Cioran, by the way, only worshipped music, not God or philosophy or anything else. Music. He would return to Bach over and over again, for example. Okay, this book, the one that I'm sort of focusing on today, it's not exactly my favorite, but it's sort of perfect for doing a 40-minute review here. This book was published in 1952, and it is suffused with the pessimism that you might expect following World War II. Cioran seems prophetic to me when he says, quote, "In vain the West seeks a form of final agony worthy of its past." He's really resigned to it. This is one of the most consistent themes in his work, not just in this book, the end of civilization. And he offers something like a diagnosis here, or like a post-mortem. Quote, "A millennium of warfare consolidated the West. A century of psychology has ripped it to tatters." And I guess this is what I mean about having to meet him halfway. That's a pretty cryptic diagnosis, right? Sort of elliptical. But if you go slow, you understand him. I mean, 1,000 years of war is sort of how the West was brought together as a meaningful thing. And that painful negotiation, in the realism of the battlefield, is where identities were formed and alliances were finally settled and meaning was made, such that Europe or the West could signify something meaningful. But then, since the middle of the 19th century, psychology, he puts it in sarcasm quotes, being himself a skeptic of the project of psychology, I think, has ruined the whole project of Europe, he seems to suggest or imply here. So all this relatively disconnected lyricism in the book, well, I mean, what is it for? Like, what is it about? Like, what is he writing about? Okay, Cioran is following Nietzsche, I think, and trying to do better than Camus, by the way. He was not exactly impressed with a lot of his contemporaries. Like, I think he called Camus a hack or something at one point. So the death of God, for example, is one of his concerns. A very typical 20th century modernist concern. And downstream of that, like what it means for us in terms of self and mind and self-conception and what it's like to be a human and so on. Probably with a heavy drop of hyperbole in this next aphorism, he says, quote, "Right in the middle of serious studies, I discovered that one day I would die. My modesty was shaken. Convinced that I had nothing left to learn, I abandoned my studies to inform the world of such a remarkable discovery." So yeah, that's one of his main concerns, death. What it is, how we face it. And that's all very much in step with philosophy, right? With Socrates, who, to study philosophy is to learn how to die or whatever. But Cioran is not like, he's not one of these anti-natalist, death worshippers. I mean, he was not a suicide. He wants to experience the suffering to the very end. But he doesn't want to turn himself into a pundit of death or a sophist speaking of systems all the time. He says, quote, "No longer ask me for my program. Isn't breathing one?" Again, this is cryptic, but if you play it back and think about it for a second, you'll understand his implicit audience, who he's responding to, why he's saying it. Cioran is never foolishly consistent. He will mock God as dead or never existing, but then he'll throw in an aphorism that says something like, quote, "For all eternity, God has chosen everything for us, down to our neckties." And you feel that in some way he is beyond a faith-doubt dichotomy. He's stuck, neither believing nor disbelieving, and he knows it. He says, quote, "What anxiety when one is not sure of one's doubts and wonders. Are these actually doubts?" I mean, I've always really enjoyed it when authors ask readers questions like that. It's sort of an inversion of the presupposed hierarchy, right? After all, he's the author, he's the authority. Why is he asking me whether his doubts are actual doubts? But in questions like these, when you come across them in a text that's sort of like earnest or sincere, you see a man on full display, right? A man rather than a system or a program or a utopian scheme. Cioran talks occasionally of masks, which is of course interesting to those of us living under global medical tyranny in 2021. I mean, the psychology of masks is kind of increasingly fascinating, I think. Here's a couple of aphorisms dealing with masks. First, quote, "In proportion as we liquidate our shames, we discard our masks. The day comes when the game ends. No more shames, no more masks, and no more public. We have presumed too much on our secrets, on the vitality of our woes." And again, quote, "We take refuge behind our countenance. The madman is betrayed by his. He offers himself, denounces himself to others. Having lost his mask, he publishes his anguish, imposes it on the first comer, parades his enigmas. So much indiscretion is irritating. It is only natural that we consign him to straitjackets and isolation wards. It's interesting to me that when people have heard of Cioran, they'll often associate him with fascism, and that's kind of all they know about him. I mean, I say that because, in fact, he seems very apolitical to me, or at least, like, sometimes determinedly indifferent to politics, other times, like, purposely ineffective politically. It's the indifference that comes from studying history enough, I think. He was a reader of Spengler and may have accepted the idea of cyclical regime change, whether from Spengler or Plato or wherever, as a matter of course. He visited Romania as late as 1940 and was, that year at least, a supporter of the Iron Guard. But for what it's worth, by the 1970s, he says he was regretting his affiliation with that movement. I mean, I don't know. Here's a little bit that seems relevant. He says in this book, quote, "By barbarity, Hitler attempted to save an entire civilization. His enterprise was a failure. It was nonetheless the West's last initiative. No doubt Europe deserved something better. Who is to blame if it could not produce a higher quality monster?" So, okay, I mean, I guess I can see why some people think Cioran was a fascist, but at the same time, even by 1952, he sees that the last hurrah is over, the last shot is spent. Europe is toast. And whatever Hitler was trying to do didn't work, and now it can't work. But even here, his pessimism is astounding, even while it's sort of beautiful. He sees the defeat and merely eulogizes it. He says, quote, "When Rome called back her legions, she was unaware of history and the lessons of twilight. Such is not our case. What grim Messiah is about to fall upon us?" Again, 1952. That's I don't know. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I started to feel like I was born, after the big disaster. Born when it was already too late to do anything about it, to, change the course of history. Cioran confirms this hunch for me. In fact, he seems to twist the knife a little. He sinks even lower. Quote, "This continent of ours may not have played its last card after all. What if it were to set about demoralizing the rest of the world, spreading its corruptions there? That would be, for Europe, a way of preserving its prestige a little longer, exerting its influence." So, like, LOL, I mean, kind of yikes, but also prophetic, isn't it? The atheism, the liberated sexuality, the refusal to fight, the final acceding to capitalism, the money changing. This is all a global program now, which was a European program, after World War II. Cioran sometimes gives what feels like advice or insight, at least. For example, when he says, quote, "After 30, one should be no more interested in events than an astronomer in gossip." Or I guess that's not really advice, is it? But sometimes, the insight maybe is the right word, something like that. Sometimes he also tells tiny little short stories, personal stories. I always love these. For example, at one point he says, quote, "I knew nothing about her. Our encounter nonetheless took the most macabre turn. I spoke to her of the sea, of a certain commentary on Ecclesiastes, and imagine my stupefaction when, after my tirade on the hysteria of the waves, she produced this remark: 'Self-pity is not a good thing.'" Okay, let me return to the God stuff again, because that is really sort of the essential element of modernism, this, turn away from God, away from religion. I actually love Cioran's writing about religion. One of his books called Tears and Saints was all about the Catholic saints and Bach and a few other high and dignified things. To be sure, he believes in none of it, but that's sort of why he continues returning to the question. there these things remain, the saints, the music, arguing that after all, the universe was not a failure totally. Do you know what fatuous means? Fatuous means like silly, so fatuousness means silliness. Cioran says at one point, quote, "If I believed in God, my fatuousness would be limitless. I would walk naked in the streets." ... Right? He ends a lot of these with ellipses. And I think that's where you're supposed to make your imagination active again, to try to go beyond the language and visualize it. Start to see it as an image in your head. Why would belief in God make a man become silly? Why would it make him go naked in the streets? What else might he do if he would do that? And so on. Cioran writes with obvious learning when he writes of the Bible and of history and of the history of religion. Sometimes it even seems respectful, but he is certainly no Christian. You might even ask why we read this guy, all the pessimism, the modernism, the mockery of Christianity. I think he saves himself a little bit, at least as literature goes, by his self-awareness in all these categories. He's aware that he's not fully in the game. He's not fully Dasein, we might say. I think this is the final and definitive symptom of modernism. It's just the awareness that something is off. And even an awareness sometimes of what is off, but still a feeling of being unable to rectify it. Cioran says, quote, "Even when we believe we have dislodged God from our soul, he still lingers. We realize that he finds it tedious there, but we no longer have sufficient faith to entertain him." It's really hard reading. I advise you to save it for your lowest points, I guess. Whether he intended it this way or not, there is something sort of redeeming, I think, or at least there was for me in my 20s, about discovering that someone else has been this low psychologically. It's interesting, I remember in my 20s everybody was on antidepressants, and I never took them, but all my friends were on antidepressants. And I think I made it through that phase reading Cioran. We all felt like a kind of lost generation. Gen X never got its comeuppance, you know what I mean? It was like my boomer parents were telling me to wait my turn, pay my dues until I was 35. And by that point, everything was focused on the millennials, basically. The moment had passed. It was very, T.S. Eliot proof rock in that way, something like that. But, to me, that is a kind of psychologically salvific thing, right? Anyway, I'm about finished with this episode, and I think to end, well, I'm going to go a little beyond this, but I think to end the Cioran portion, I'll just read you the last of his entries. This one is one of those short personal stories, and it goes like this. Quote, "When I was barely an adolescent, the prospect of death flung me into trances. To escape them, I rushed to the brothel, where I invoked the angels. But with age, you become used to your own terrors. You undertake nothing more in order to be disengaged from them. You become quite bourgeois in the abyss. And although there was a time when I envied those Egyptian monks who dug their own graves in order to shed tears within them, if I were to dig mine now, all I would drop in there would be cigarette butts." Okay, so I have a little time for commentary, and I want to return to that question about Heidegger and Jesus, where does Cioran fit in that dynamic? Okay, my idea is that unfortunately few people have had the time and energy to read from both currents of style, of register. Okay, that is, too few people have read closely and with understanding both Heidegger, for example, and, for example, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets closely. And too few people, and I mean seriously very, very few, maybe only dozens in the whole world. And among those, we would be lucky if there were one or two competent teachers among them who could share with us what it is they discovered or discerned in grasping the essence of both strains of expression. Okay, again, too few people have understood both Herman Melville's works and Schopenhauer's works. Or too few people have understood both Wallace Stevens' poetry and Plato's philosophy. Now, because so few people have been able to switch hit like that, have been able to read in both streams, and because among those who have read in both streams, so few are truly called teachers, in the sense, in the high sense of the word. I don't mean professors or something, I mean like teachers. What I'm saying here is that, what I'm saying might be really hard to understand for anyone. And again, it's only a hypothesis. Because, by the way, I'm I'm not the guy. I've only read a little bit of Heidegger and barely understood it. I've read more T.S. Eliot, you understand? But my claim here is that for some reason, in our era, philosophical prose tends to have more prestige among people who are trying to speak of these ideas. But poetry and narrative, I think, are equal to the task of communicating these matters to careful readers. And when I say equal, I mean that something like 1 out of 100 readers of this stuff will really get it. Again, what Michael Millerman says of Heidegger, which is not something I've quite been able to locate or grasp in Heidegger myself. I'm close, I feel like, but I haven't quite pinpointed it in my own reading. But this is what Millerman says, and he sounds right, and it's something I've suspected, is that there is an almost conversion experience being described in Heidegger that's a conversion into Dasein, which is what, according to Heidegger, we fundamentally are, right? But listen, talking about converting into Dasein is perhaps not the same thing as converting into Dasein. So, as Millerman said at the beginning of this video, the one that I plugged in there, we have a tendency to talk about things without understanding them, without really getting them, without understanding what they're alluding to or pointing to. And so part of what we want to understand in all of this is that speech, both philosophical prose and the lyrical poetry, can at times aim to catalyze something like an inward change in the nature of the reader. In other words, you're not just trying to wag your Martin Heidegger around and go I read this, I know what it says, because what it says isn't really important. It's if go back and watch my Buddhist, the Sermon on the Diamond Sutra, right? It's this is just a raft to get you across the river. Once you've crossed the river, discard it, right? So that's the idea. That's the idea that I think we're trying to get at. And so, if you understand that, it's the inward change that is the fruit of all of this rhetoric or this sophistry that we're trying to attain or acquire. Remember Matthew the evangelist recalling Isaiah, quote, this is Matthew 13, 14-ish. So they show that what Isaiah said about them is true. You people will listen and listen, but you will not understand. You will look and look, but you will not really see. Yes, the minds of these people are now closed. They have ears, but they don't listen. They have eyes, but they refuse to see. If their minds were not closed, they might see with their eyes. They might hear with their ears. They might understand with their minds. Then they might turn back to me and be healed. But God has blessed you. You, Jesus says to his disciples, you understand what you see with your eyes, and you understand what you hear with your ears. And that might almost be said to be what it is that makes them his disciples, even. So the question I'm trying to really ask here is what if philosophical prose, the kind we find in Heidegger, is, for whatever reason, and it really might be interesting to, it really might be interesting to try to understand as a side project why certain registers or styles are more effective than others during certain historical epochs or certain phases in the cycle of civilizations, by the way. But anyway, what if philosophical prose is less effective at catalyzing the change, the conversion, than something like poetry? Or what if philosophical prose is less effective for some people than poetry or lyricism or something? Then, okay, in that case, it wouldn't be at all that Heidegger is wrong or less right about all of this than Cioran or T.S. Eliot or whoever, but his argument might not lead as often, might not catalyze the change that we're after as often in readers. Which is to say, one might actually be initiated into Dasein without knowing the term Dasein. Okay? I hope you understand that. Speaking of T.S. Eliot, listen to this little bit from the Four Quartets. I'm almost done. But I want to do an episode on Eliot pretty soon. But he's basically a contemporary of Heidegger, and I think he's thinking similar thoughts, but he's going to express them very, very differently. Okay? This is about 10 lines of poetry. Quote, "If you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, at any time or at any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than any order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind, or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Here, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always." One of the lines in the Gospel of John that's been growing on me lately as I consider all these things is in verse 13:36, where Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Isn't that awesome? Anyway, we'll continue to follow this thread, or is it these threads, in the next few episodes. One on Heidegger, one on Montaigne to come soon, and then at least one on T.S. Eliot, and then back to Plutarch too. I want to do more on Plutarch. Okay, I'm done for this episode. Thanks for listening. Check out the link to Patreon if you want to join. We're going to have a secret stream this Friday, so it's not too late, and those are always good conversations. I appreciate your listening and your support. Thanks. Bye.